Today's guest, Ethan Gallogly. He's the author of the Amazon bestseller The Trail and an expert in hiking, backpacking, and the history of the John Muir Trail in the Sierra Nevada. He also just happens to be a professor of chemistry and written a number of textbooks on the subject. So all right, everybody, let's head into the wild wilderness today on the Open Highway.
This episode is brought to you by Our Weird World. Every week, I, John Henson, dive into weird, crazy, and forgotten stories from the history books that you have probably never heard before. I try to put some humor into it, or maybe I just come off sounding like a dick. That's really up for you to decide. But join me every Monday. Subscribe everywhere that you get your podcasts.
Hey everybody, Eric here. I just wanted to take a moment and thank you for your continuing support for the Open Highway. And I have news for you. The Open Highway is now on Substack. That's right, head on over to Substack where we take a deeper dive into the news of the day, the topics that you hear on the show, or pretty much whatever I'm interested in. The link is in the show notes, so head on over and sign up, and now you can be part of the conversation. But most of all, thanks for listening.
The Open Highway with Eric Erickson.
So the fun thing about you is that you are not only a lover of the outdoors, an advocate for getting out onto the trail, but you're also a chemistry professor. How does that happen? Those don't seem like two things that would go hand in hand.
Thanks, Eric. That's an interesting question. Being a backpacker and a professor don't overlap, but in terms of time, they do. In other words, teaching gives me the summers off where I can really shift gears from being, all the stress and intensity of teaching and working to the freedom and relaxation of being out in the wilderness. So they complement each other really nicely is what they do. And I don't know if you know the history, but J.N. LeConte, who did a lot of the mapping on the John Muir Trail, was a professor at Cal at Berkeley. And he very similarly would take his summers off. It was his summer project back in the 1800s to go out and map the JMT. So time-wise, it's compatible. And when you go out into the wilderness, I think a good number of the long-term hikers who aren't students or kids or retirees are teachers like myself.
So when you're in the classroom, does your mind ever wander and you're like, I can't wait to get out into you're almost like a student looking out the window. You're like, oh, it'd be a good day for a hike.
Well, I love teaching, so the time goes fast, but there are certainly days where if I've got a trip coming up, I'm thinking about, I've got to get that resupply planned, or I've got to get this lined up. But I don't spend a lot of time anticipating the future. I sort of live in the moment. And when the class ends and the summer starts, it's like, wahoo, and I'm off to the wilderness.
You whip off the suede jacket with the pads on the elbows. You're like, I'm out.
Yeah, I don't dress like a professor out there. If my students ever found me in the wilderness, I'd be, the term hiker trash, right? I'd look like somebody who'd been, out in the wilderness for weeks, and you end up wearing the same clothes and so forth, and you don't always get to wash them frequently. So I would not look like I do when I teach.
Do you take the lessons? Do they cross over? Do things that you know and you learn out in the wilderness, do you bring them into the classroom at all? Does that ever help you with working with your students and teaching chemistry? Do they cross over?
That's an interesting question. I don't. Yes, to a very small extent. When we teach chemistry, we talk about the air pressure, for example, getting lower as you go to a higher altitude. And I'll talk about the tree line and why is it that trees get smaller at altitude. And I'll pull in some of these examples from, from mountaineering and stuff like that, but not too much. Sometimes with water chemistry and environmental chemistry, I'll be able to use examples. And it helps me relate to a lot of the students. I would say every semester I get 4 or 5 kids who are really into the outdoors, and I have it on my profile, my teaching profile that I backpack. So they see that, and often that'll be a good connection with them.
But that's who you are. Like, that's just you as a person. That's kind of, you also probably like chocolate cake, or you enjoy walks in the rain or something. So it's all cumulative of who you are and what you bring to the table. So it's hard to separate one thing,
Yes.
Pigeonhole you. We can't pigeonhole you.
No, I don't think you can pigeonhole anybody. I mean, that's a challenge.
People try, though. They try.
People are pretty complex.
Yeah. What's up? You have this backdrop behind you. I mean, it's a stunning picture.
Where is that this summer? Thanks for asking, by the way.
It's a gorgeous photo.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. I took it this summer. This is Evolution Lake in the Evolution Valley, which is probably one of the most stunning areas on the John Muir Trail, and was named by Theodore Solomons, the explorer who first wandered up there. And I do talk about that in my book, the early explorers and what they went through. And he thought it was brilliant, and he named the peaks there for, at that time, I think the 5 different major evolutionists, like Darwin, Wallace, Spencer, and so forth. And so this is Evolution Lake in the background. And then the peaks you see, or like zoom, I can't point at it, look all discoordinated, but the peaks you're seeing are actually past the Evolution Basin. That's the Goddard Divide. That's in between Mount Solomon's on my left, and the Mount Goddard on the right. So that's the Goddard Divide. Those are unnamed peaks in the background, but you're looking up the canyon towards where you would walk up to Muir Pass, and it's gorgeous up there.
It's really stunning. It reminds me of almost like a stereograph, like, because the way the photo you shot, there's definite levels and planes in that shot, and it's fascinating to me. So when you're out there, is it a meditative experience for you? Is it can you describe that for me? Because I enjoy going hiking like everybody else, but you teach in Santa Monica, so that here in California we have California hiking, which is like, hey, let's go up to Mescal Canyon for a half hour, and woof, that was tough with my water bottle. But when you go on a real hike, a real expedition, like the things that you do, I would think that it was a much more emotional, intellectual. I would think it would touch on so many different levels as a human being. Is that true? Is that what you experience?
Oh, yes. So, I mean, in part, this is why I wrote the book, to share that experience with the readers. As you know from reading it, I start with Gil, who doesn't like camping. He's afraid of the bugs and the dirt. He doesn't want to be out there. But then I gradually show the spiritual side. I gradually show, what you go through on one of these long hikes spiritually. And I try to share that with the readers. So what happens typically is, on a hike like you're describing, on a day hike, there is a certain sense of relaxation, of just being at peace with yourself in the wilderness. And when you backpack, particularly on a long backpack, you take that to the nth degree, because what happens is, even on a one-night backpack, you no longer have to worry about where you're going to be the next day. That night you're setting up your tent and you're going to be in the woods. So all that worry about, I've got to be at a meeting and I've got to be back and I've got to meet my wife for dinner, and whatever else is in your head is gone. All you got to do is set your tent up and camp. So on a one-night backpack, you suddenly put down all that stress and relax. And when you're going for like I do, a month or 2 or longer, it's even more so. It becomes, like you said, meditative. And as you're walking, you start to reflect on yourself and your life and the issues that you're facing. And for some people, it's even a kind of pilgrimage, a kind of spiritual pilgrimage. In the book, I like to say that recreation is recreation, a little play on the word, but getting out there and just walking allows you really to reflect on your life. It allows you to think about the good and the bad. It's not typically just empty meditation, but really gives you time to mull over things that in our busy life in the city, we just don't pause and reflect on in the way that you can out in the wilderness. So for anybody who's got questions about what they should be doing or how their life is going or their relationships, even on a 3 or 4 day trip, it is a wonderfully reflective time. And I can't recommend it enough. It can be life-changing, particularly these longer hikes.
Yeah, I would really think, I would just think that once you get that noise taken away, once you get the electronics and the people and the buzz and the city and whatever it is, there's nobody in between you and finding out who you are. And I would even think that some people would have that and they wouldn't like what they saw. Once it's looking in that mirror and seeing exactly what's looking back at you.
So it is possible. And, this is the difference between going with a friend maybe and a solo hike. And it's a great point you're bringing up. On a solo hike, you may have no one to talk to. Literally, you may be on your own in the wilderness. And if you're not comfortable with that solitude and that peace, it might not be a very comfortable thing for some. For me, I love it, but I would never tell anyone to start out solo. If you go with a buddy or something like this, you can chat, right? You can talk, you can enjoy time by the fire, but you're going to still have some solo time when you're walking. You're probably not going to be at the same pace. So you get a taste of it and you can see if you're comfortable. And I think you're right, Eric. There are people who keep themselves busy because they don't want to face that question of who am I? What is my life? What is my purpose? And so they're always scheduling that next meeting to avoid those big questions. And even though it might be uncomfortable, it might be the worst painful thing for someone to go through that, it's probably even more important for someone in that situation to realize, oh my God, I'm not doing the right thing with my life. And maybe take some time out to question it or reaffirm that they're happy with what they're doing. Yeah, I think it's valuable for anyone, but yeah, it can be scary.
Do you ever take anyone out with you and right away you even on a short hike, you look at them, you're like, this is not going to go well. This person is either physically or emotionally like, nah, this is not going to go well.
Yeah, when I was a backpacking leader, years ago now, I haven't led a backpacking trip where I didn't know the people. But years ago, I led trips for Sierra Club and the Outdoors Club of California and the Berkeley Hiking Club. And you'd get people on the trip who had never been. And things can go wrong and people can freak out. And there was one trip where it was a disaster. We had 2 people sign up and we said, this is a trip for people who know how to backpack. This is not an easy trip. And both people signed up and one of them had never backpacked, but he didn't tell us. We didn't know. He just sort of kept it to himself. It got to be a rainy day. He was like, oh, I'll catch up with you guys. And, we thought nothing of it. Turned out he freaked out in the rain. He hid inside a tree, which was a hollow tree, which is the wrong thing to do because he picked up some ticks and, got dirty. And then he tried to follow us in the rain. The rain came down, swelled the river we had crossed, so he couldn't cross. He was counting on the other guy for a shelter. We couldn't get back across when we discovered, that he was behind us. So we were stuck on one side of this river. He was somewhere on the other side, and this guy got hypothermic. And when we turned back, when we finally were able to ford the river again and get back, because we knew we had to. We found the guy had slept under a picnic table, was shivering, was just way out
I
of it.
shouldn't laugh.
No, it was, these things happen. And we were so glad we found him, because
Yeah.
we would have walked right by, but we heard this rustling in the bushes and there was this guy, we're like, what are you doing there? And he didn't know what he was doing because he was hypothermic.
Oh,
But
God.
it was a disaster and it was totally preventable. All he had to do was say, this is my first trip. I've never been backpacking. And even though it wouldn't have been fun, we would have babysat him, we would have gone slower. But the fact that he had told us that he knew what he was up to, we just assumed it was okay.
Was
So
it ego? What was it on his part? I mean, I don't want you to out him or
don't
anything.
know. He was a nice guy, but I think because we had advertised the trip for experienced people, and when he called up, I screened him and I said, "You've been backpacking?" And he's like, "Oh yeah, many times." So it sounded like he knew what he was up to, and it was an online trip, and so we didn't. There's no disclosure forms. We didn't question that deeply. We just believed people.
Yeah.
But the second day when we found him, we knew something was wrong, and that's when he admitted it all. He said he'd never backpacked and he freaked out.
Wow. And the self-reliance that you need to have, or you need to learn on some of these excursions, must be off the chart. Because I dated somebody who was into doing these extreme hikes to, not Everest or anything like that, but similar to what you do. And I know there's classes that they're taking, there's survival classes that they take, and they're not just like little afternoon, here's what's going on. I mean, they learn equipment, they learn survival techniques, they learn hypothermia, they learn all of these things. So if you're not self-reliant, if you can't take care of yourself, it can be incredibly dangerous.
Yeah, there's a certain level of experience you need. And it depends in part on what you're going to do. For example, if you're going to go into snow in early season, you need a lot of skills. You need to know avalanche safety, you need to know route finding, you need to know snow shelters and survival, and how to use crampons and ice axes so you don't slide off cliffs. Mm-hmm. But if you're going in the summer, in the regular season, you should know how to get out. You should have a way of contacting someone, maybe an in-reach device or one of these satellite messengers. But it's not as life-threatening as you might expect. Usually, if you're not going into a very remote area and you're not doing major river crossings with no bridge, you're not pushing yourself too far. Usually there's a trail, usually there are people around, and if you needed help, it's a very nice community out there, and I think somebody would be able to help you.
There are. I've met a lot of the people, and they really are very supportive. I mean, if you love something, you love the outdoors, you love going on these excursions, on these hikes, you want to share something that you love with other people. So of course you're going to be, open-armed, really just be kind of like, yeah, if you're interested in the same thing, I wanted to share the love that I have for this. Like, I'm sure you love chemistry too, or else you wouldn't have become a chemistry professor. But I wonder what more people rather like, what they gravitate toward more, the outdoors or the chemistry, like a Bunsen burner or a
They're both different. One is science and one is nature. And yeah, of course there's science of nature, but my heart's in both. I think if you push came to shove, I think I like the outdoors a little more. I'm very, very much into the natural surroundings. When I retire, I'll probably stop teaching chem, but I'll keep hiking.
Are you a Thoreau type? Like, are you the type that you could go live in a cabin up in the woods for endless amounts of time, just contemplate the universe?
Oh my!
Or do you like your Starbucks?
That's a great question. I am so divided there. Yeah, I love Thoreau. Thoreau is one of my favorite authors. I'm glad you brought him up, Eric. He's really an amazing writer. But one thing you should know about Thoreau is on the weekends, he would take his laundry and go home and visit his mother. He doesn't, it's true.
I didn't know that.
In fact, I had one of the foremost Thoreau scholars in college teach teach Walden to us, and we talked about this stuff. Fantastic book. So Thoreau, yeah, I could live in a cabin in the woods, but I would miss the company. I would miss talking with people. I would miss that college environment. So
Yeah.
I think I'm on the fence. I think I can do 2 months in the woods and 2 months in the city and just back and forth kind of thing.
I could deal with that. I could handle that. So we keep mentioning your book, The Trail, which is a bestseller, which, right, first and foremost, congratulations on that. I mean, that's, as a writer myself, I know the path. So well done, sir. What got you? Why did you want to share the story the way that you did? Why did you want to share this experience in a novel form like that?
Well, so what happened, the story behind the story, I guess, is I had hiked the JMT. This was 2016 when I turned 50. And I'd hiked half of it with one friend, and then my wife came in and joined me. So the other half with my wife. But I was in the wilderness continuously for this 28-day trip. And after it, I couldn't get that trip out of my head. Every day, everywhere I went, I was just thinking about the JMT. Scenery like what I've got behind me here was just, I would walk the trail again and again in my mind. And I wanted to share that with somebody. I wanted to share the experience, the transformative nature of it, and all that. And I had set up to do a lecture at my college. I had scheduled a little lecture where I would present, and I started, as I do as a professor, to research the history and other details. It was fascinating. Well, one thing led to another, and the lecture got canceled. We had another speaker come in who needed the spot, and I lost the spot that year. But I'd realized I'd had, and that was probably the best, most fortuitous canceling I'd ever had, because I realized I had all this material on the history, all this stuff, and this fantastic experience. I'd never been out in the wilderness that long. I had this fantastic experience I wanted to share. And so I said, well, I'd like to write that up as some kind of book, but I can't write a history book or a memoir, because if I write a history book, no one's going to buy it, right? Who wants to read the history of the John Muir Trail? There are probably 8 to 10 people out there who'd buy that particular book. You're probably one, Eric. I know
I probably would pick it up. Yeah.
But it would have a pretty small following. And I wanted to reach more people and share that information. And the story of my hike, if I wrote it up as a memoir, would not be that interesting. It'd be okay, but it wouldn't be compelling reading. So I thought, I've got 30 years of hiking experience. I got a lot of good stories I can tell. Let's weave them into a novel. Let's create something that people will really read and get into, and I can share some of the more spiritual and deeper aspects. I can share the history of the trail. And so that was the seed for writing the book. And 5 years later, here we are.
What was your process? Because have you written before that?
I have a chemistry textbook I was a co-author on, and that taught me quite a bit about the writing process in books, but it did not teach me about fiction writing. Fiction writing was a whole nother animal. In fact, the first draft of this book I thought was brilliant, and everyone I gave it to said was unreadable. They said it was, it read like a trail guide or something. It really wasn't a compelling story. The characters were flat. It really needed a lot of work.
Okay, so how did that feel as a writer? Welcome to the fiction writers world. When you handed that over, your child, you hand your child over, and they say your child needs remedial skills. Is basically what is going on. How did that feel?
Just fine.
Oh, come on. Really?
I'm serious.
Okay.
I probably went through a short period of, you didn't like it? I being surprised. But I had the experience, those experiences with the chemistry book. Yeah. I had written, it took me 5 years to write a chemistry book. And when I was done with that, I handed it to revise one. I handed it to my co-author and I said, I think we're set. And he just smiled and he read it and he started giving me the corrections and my heart sank. And I realized, oh my God, there's so much more work that needs to be done here. And everything I thought was brilliant was not. So I went through that on my first book, and I know exactly what you're saying. My first baby was like, yeah, everything changed. So with the novel, I expected it. It wasn't a surprise.
Did you feel like you were learning though, like as they came back to you with these notes and you're starting to look at it, did it fall into place? And you're like, oh, if I do this, this will happen. Or if I implement this, it'll make this this thread stronger, or this character. Like, did you learn as you went?
Exactly. And you must have this experience too, right? I mean, you wrote a number of books. So I think you know how this goes. I love the process. I think the first draft took me about a year, and then it was 3.5 years of editing. So in the editing, I went through, I'd say 7, 8 drafts, where each draft I was fixing one thing that they had focused on, that my editors had focused on, and my readers, and I'd hand it out and they'd have another thing, and they'd be major things. Like in one case, it was story, and in another case, it was characters. And, as we got down to it, it was background. People would say, well, okay, you described the scenery beautifully, but I don't taste it. I don't feel it. I don't hear the sounds of the birds. So it's like you're painting a picture, like one of these Monet pictures where you're putting all the little dots, and then you're putting the dots inside the dots, and the dots inside that, until the whole picture takes shape. So it's level upon level, maybe like an oil painting. And eventually you have that whole novel. I guess Eric, you've got to know from your books, there's that rumor or that belief out there that a writer will sit down and type out a book and it's done. That's kind of the fantasy and the dream.
It's the Kerouac myth. You can sit down and get high as all get out, and you can hammer out a book in 72 hours.
Somebody was editing his books.
Yeah, somebody did.
Have you ever typed out a book where there was zero editing or even light editing?
Oh my, no. And I have, as a writer, I actually enjoy the editing process more as I become more and more familiar with the different formats. Because I started out as a journalist and a screenwriter, and then you move to novels. And you're like, oh, it's just a different kind of writing. Yeah. And then you're like, no, it's not at all. And like you said, like somebody will say something about your story and you start to fix it, and then you pull at that thread and you're like, okay, well, I'll fix this. But as you're pulling that thread, you realize it's attached to so many other things. So when you fix that, or you pull that thread, you have to fix everything else along the road that it's touching. And if you pull too hard, suddenly it could go really wrong. But if you're lucky, it amplifies it. It gets that immersion that you were talking about, where people like just lose themselves in it, and they hear the birds and they hear the water and everything. That's the goal, right? Yeah. I mean, that's not any different when you're in the classroom, because if you're trying to get these students to become immersed in chemistry, you want them to get it. And if there's something they're not getting, does that ever happen to you as a teacher? Because you're like, oh my God, the students aren't getting it. And some teachers are like, oh, it's because the students are stupid. But a lot of times it's because the teacher just hasn't figured out the right way to connect with those individual students, because everyone learns differently. I think writing's the same.
I totally agree with you, Eric. I think in teaching, you have to figure out how it connects to that particular kid, how they learn best, what example is going to reach them best. And when you think of it and you put it that way, you see their face light up, and there's that understanding, and you've reached them. And you're right, it's the same with editing. It's the same with the book. I remember my sister saying to me, because my sister's a writer, she said to me, you might want to start with a little shorter book, because this book is really a long book. And
how long is it? How many pages is it again? It's like
several hundred pages.
Yeah.
So she had said, maybe you want to do a few short stories. That way you can get used to it. And I'd lived in China for 5 years, and I've studied some, martial arts and some other stuff. And I saw this like a martial art, like perfecting something. And if
Mm.
you've ever done martial arts, it's exactly like you describe. It's layer upon layer. You perfect your walking, and then you've got your body's motion, and then you've got your balance, and everything affects everything else. If you're learning balance, it may change your walking again. So this is how I saw the book. I thought, no, a long book is even better, because every time I go back and correct something, it's like training. It's like honing that samurai sword and making myself a better writer. And
Mm.
having to go through 300 pages of it means I will never make that same mistake. It'll be ingrained in me. And so I loved the process, and I saw it as self-perfection. As, let's call it self-improvement. I don't think we ever perfect ourselves, but as self-improvement. And I think I am a much better writer now. I hope I am, than I was when I started this process. Did you ever read Memoir of a Geisha?
No, I didn't read it. I saw the movie. I
Okay.
didn't actually read the book, though. I have to admit, I didn't. It
So
was in my house for a long time. I never read it.
there's a story behind that book. That book was a PhD thesis. The author of that book had done his PhD on Japanese geishas, and he wrote a novel about it after his PhD. And it took him, I think, 7 to 9 rewrites between something that was scholarly in style to something that was a compelling novel that obviously became a
Mhm.
bestseller. And when I was doing this, I just kept thinking about that book, because I felt like I was going through what he went through on his book. I really saw, and when I look back now at the early editions, I really see the change, and the
Yeah, yeah.
change in writing and style. And I thank every one of those editors. I know you said you feel terrible, sometimes when a person comes back and says, oh, this isn't good. I feel happy. I feel peaceful. I feel I'm going to improve, and the next draft will be better, and I'll be a better writer for it.
That might be maturity too, because
Oh,
I remember
could
being a
be.
young, 20-year-old writer, and I'm like, I just wrote the great American novel. And then some
Right.
people read it, and they're like, no, you didn't. So that went in the drawer. Yeah. Oh, but it happens. What lessons did you learn that you'll be able to take on to the next book? Like, are there concrete things that you learned stylistically or writing wise?
Yes, many. I just don't think I can express them. If I could express those things, I'd be some kind of master writing teacher. It's just like martial arts. You learn by doing, and you absorb it within your body and your mind.
Yeah.
But I don't think I can put it into words. The greatest book I ever read on writing, you probably read it, was Stephen King's book on writing.
Hmm.
Have you read that?
I
See,
have.
and what's brilliant about that book is he doesn't tell you how to write. He does it all by example. It's
Yeah.
all examples. And as you read it, you realize he's showing me how to write. He's not telling me, except for that section on grammar. So
It
I
is
mean,
important.
it is. It is. I learned a lot of grammar too. Some just basic stuff that I hadn't realized, but I couldn't express it. And I think Stephen King hit it the best way, was you have to show by example, and you really have to learn by doing. So
Yeah.
if
Yeah.
somebody wanted to be a writer out there, I would say, well, first you have to have the temperament. You have to be willing to sit at your computer for 5 or 6 hours a day, every day, and
Mhm.
love it, and not be frustrated with editing and rewriting. Some days you spend 3 hours on a sentence, and that's okay. That's, you know what I'm saying, right?
I do. I think it's interesting because I agree with you as far as it's I can't sit down and I have people that come up to me all the time and they're like, help me write this, or how do I do this? And it's kind of what you said. I'm like, just sit down and write. It's, you're going to figure it out. But one thing that I do tell a lot of people is you don't have the same set of tools for every project. You should have a toolbox. For example, like when you write a chemistry book, you're going to approach that differently than when you wrote the novel. There's different tools that you have as a writer, just the way you would spin a sentence or the way you would plot out the outline or something like that. And, everyone's different. Like I went to high school with Tom Robbins's son, Fleet. We were acquaintances in high school, and I got to chat with his dad a few times. And for those who don't know, he wrote, Skinny Legs and All and Still Life with Woodpecker, and these incredibly different books. And I was chatting with him about it, and he basically said, he's like, when I'm done with a sentence, I'm done with a sentence. He's like, I will work on a paragraph for hours, but once that paragraph's done, I'm done. And he had an agreement with his editor that they weren't allowed to change anything without his permission. And that's his style. That would drive me up the wall, because I would come back to something a couple of days later and be like, no, there's a different way, because this doesn't jive with this paragraph, or I've already said this, or it's just not clicking the way that I want. And another lesson I learned, and I'm curious about you, about the trail, when I was a young Kerouac wannabe who thought I could sit down and just let the characters come to me and write crazy, it would ramble and it would go on, and there was no plot and there was no stakes. But once I got to the point, and this really happened when I started writing screenplays, because a lot of the times they sit down and they say, here's what's going to happen when you get hired. Here's act 1, here's act 2, here's act 3, here's what your characters do, fill in the blanks. And once I kind of approached it as like, it's okay to chart out my story. It's okay to sit down and plan and be like, okay, here's where I want my characters to go. Here's the themes I want to tell. Here's the skeleton. Now I'm going to go on. I'm going to put the muscle on. I'm going to put the skin on. I'm going to put the nerves in there. So when you wrote The Trail, how did you approach that? Did you know where you wanted to go with it? Was it more of a free form experience? A little of A, a little of B?
A little of both.
Yeah.
Yeah. So one of my friends, Tony, who's a writer, he says it's like framing a house. You build the frame, and then you add the siding and the windows and the furniture and all the details. And I really, having gone through this with a novel, I have to agree. Mm-hmm. With the chemistry textbook, of course, you know what the basic lessons are. So it's all outlined. It's more about how are you going to word things in the examples. With a novel, it's all about story, right? Mm-hmm. You have to have an overarching story. And so my story did change over drafts. I definitely had some shifts in the story, some changes in the relationship between Gil and Sid, some changes, a lot of changes in terms of when things happened in the story. But the overarching story, in other words, I can't give away the story. I don't want to give out any spoilers. But the idea that we start with this guy, Gil, and he doesn't want to backpack and doesn't want to camp, and he suffers in the beginning, but then he slowly gets into it, and he slowly builds up this relationship with Sid. He's invited to back. His father passed away when he was young. So when he was in college, and he's been wasting his life since. He was devastated. He's down in LA drinking and hooking up with women, but not really going anywhere. He's got a dead-end job that he's been laid off. And his father's old best hiking friend, Sid, calls him up. Sid's in his 60s and says, you go with me and hike the John Muir Trail. And he doesn't want to go, but he agrees, mostly because he wants to understand why his father loved camping so much. Because as it turns out, his father died on a camping trip. And so Gil goes, and he's trying to get what he needs and get off the trip, but eventually he gets into it. And so that overarching story was mostly in place when I started. Some of the details got fleshed out. Some things got trimmed. I had some other side plots that got thrown away. But the overarching thing of a young guy who doesn't want to go camping learns the beauty of camping and something of the history of the story and is transformed through nature, all of that was in place when I started. That's really the story I wanted to tell. And then I had a framework. The framework was my 28-day trip. I'd done this 28-day trip on the Muir Trail, and I said, I'll pick each of the days I did, and I'll put them as a separate chapter of this book but I'll weave the story of these guys into it, and I'll weave my own hiking experience. And then, like you said, many of the chapters wrote themselves randomly. I'd be on a trip. I was hiking the PCT through Oregon in 2017. And I remember we got to this one place, Christie Springs, which was full of mosquitoes. It was the worst mosquitoes I'd ever encountered. I was stuck in the tent. I was terrified. They were under the fly. You know, at night, you've got to go out and pee, right? But there were raging mosquitoes out there. And I'm like, what am I going to do? So I was in this experience that Oregon's mosquitoes are something else compared to the Sierra. I had never been in that kind of constant droning and buzzing. And I was in the tent and I said, you know, this story has to go into my book. And so I wrote the chapter with the mosquitoes where Gil is in the tent surrounded by mosquitoes, in a tent surrounded by mosquitoes in Oregon. And I plugged that into the story. I hadn't planned on it. It wasn't something I was going to do necessarily, but it just fit. And so I said, where would this fit? And I plugged it in.
How much of it is you, like, you just told this story about the mosquitoes, which growing up in the Northwest, I know exactly what you're talking about.
You ever been
There's
to
something about,
Springs?
I haven't, but I did live in Oregon for a while, and I've been a lot of places in the state. And there's something about Northwestern mosquitoes. They're like small birds. So you have this experience that you wove in, but how much of you is in the characters? Like, how much of your personal beliefs and experiences and your searchings ended up in these characters in the book?
Well, I'll ask the same question of you, Eric. How much of you is in your characters? Almost everything, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
When you write a novel, and this is a secret that's not a secret, when you write a novel, it's you. No matter who says they've come up with this imaginary character, it's all through your own filters. And in my book, at least, I'll speak to my book. The three main characters that you meet, Gil, Sid, and this guy Permy that you meet early on, who's a survivalist, are all aspects of my personality at different ages, different stages. Of course, they're changed. They're turned into dramatic characters. I was never as bad as Gil, and as, you know, just as he's extreme. And I'm certainly not in the position that Sid is in, of not being certain I can make a hike. And Sid, as readers will discover right away, has terminal cancer and isn't sure he's going to make the entire trip, which of course freaks Gil out. But there's something of me in each of those three characters. And yeah, I think a lot of us goes into our books. Maybe in nonfiction there isn't, but in fiction writing, I think we put a lot of ourselves, different aspects of ourselves into characters. Wouldn't you agree? I mean,
oh, I totally agree. And I think it could be therapeutic as well. I mean, it might be like the cancer thing is interesting because, you know, knock on wood, that's not something that you're dealing with, but there's still a fear, there's still health, there's still mortality, there's still all the things that we deal with. So you can blow that up in a way where you can explore it and almost work out some of your own demons. I know I've done that. I wrote a book called Ascension that was about death, but it was a sci-fi Dan Brown kind of adventure, but I still got into it and kind of dealt with some of issues that I had. And it was a way to work through it. And then you go back in and you're like, okay, well, that can go away because that's just massaging my own ego. You know, I always say I try to mammoth things sometimes. I'm like, I'm just too proud of a certain paragraph. It's because it's all flowery and happy. I'm like, that's got to go. You know, like that wasn't written for the reader. That was written for me. And those have to go.
I think half of my books have hit the cutting room floor, and that's normal. And that's something a new writer may not realize, is just how much never makes print. That you write, like you say, therapeutically, or you learn something really interesting and you put it in, and then when you're reading it or your editor's reading it, they say, well, this is too much, you need to chop it. And you just learn to let it go and trust the editor, or trust that, yes, I've learned something from this. I mean, I learned so much from the Chem book and from this book, but it can't all go in there. It just
Yeah.
can't fit and make a good story.
They're almost like speed bumps sometimes as you're reading, like things are going really well. And then it'll hit this point where it's pretty obvious that doesn't need to be in there. And it's like, as somebody's maybe gives you notes, or I read it myself, if I'm reading a draft of something I'm writing, and I suddenly look up after 5 or 6 pages and realize I haven't made any notes, that's why I'm like, okay, I'm entertaining myself as a reader, and I'm enjoying this. I'm losing myself in the story. So now I'm getting to the point where now it's just, let's polish up the grammar. Let's make sure, all the T's are crossed and the I's are dotted. But once you get to that point, there's something so wonderful about that as a creative person, because you're like, I'm the ultimate critic. You're the ultimate critic of your work. And to lose yourself in that, you're like, yeah, I got to that. The eyes light up and you're like, really got to something.
Yep.
It's that glorious part. What's been the response to your book? What's been, how are people coming back? What are people saying about it? What are the readers said when they read it? I'm sure you get wonderful emails about it.
It's been tremendous. It's been unbelievable. Do you know, you probably don't. I gotta, give me a second here. I've got to think of, can we pause for a second?
Oh, I'm not going to pause it, but I can always go back and edit out of it.
That's
so
I blanked on something. All right.
No, you're good, dude.
Let's start it again. Yeah, the response has been, thanks for asking, Eric. The response has been tremendous. Chris Townsend of the United Kingdom, who you may not know, but he's got 25 outdoors books. He's an esteemed outdoors writer, and he's one of the editors for The Great Outdoors, what do you call it? The leading outdoors magazine in the UK. He put my book in his top 15 outdoor books of 2021, and he's coming out with a big review of it. And that was a huge honor, right? I was just shocked when I saw that. I was so happy. And there are, on Amazon, it's been a bestseller. The reviews have been fantastic. I read all those reviews, and we have more 5-star reviews than anything else. And I've had some people write to me and say this book was life-changing. There's a lot of philosophy and spiritual stuff in it. I've had other people write and say, they're in their 80s or 90s. They can't go back to the wilderness anymore, but this book brought them back to the trips they took in their youth, and they lived vicariously for it. I had one gentleman who, after listening to the podcast, said not the podcast, the audiobook, said he just wished the book wouldn't end. That kind of praise just makes me so happy. I was so shocked and overwhelmed by the amount of positive response that the book has gotten, and critical reviews too. Kirkus raved about it. I sent it into Kirkus and I was nervous. I mean, Kirkus, they'll rip you a new one. I mean, they are the critical critics, and they had one little thing to say. They said, well, sometimes it's didactic because Sid, the older character, he does a lot of lecturing. He's an old college professor. But other than that one word, it was all praise. They loved it. Yeah. And Midwest Book Review, they came back saying it's, I forget exactly what they said, unreservedly recommended or something to that way. We haven't had that many critical official reviews yet, but every one of them has come back overwhelmingly positive. Reader's Choice gave it a 5-star review, and I think there were a couple of others now. But it's really been well received, and the audiobook too. In fact, we had this fantastic narrator, Jake Hunsbuscher, do the audiobook. And as a writer, you've read your book a zillion times by the time it comes out. You don't read and write it once. I probably read my book 100 times now in the editing process. But when I listen to the audiobook, because you have to listen to it as the writer and send them corrections and things, I got so into it. You talked about entertaining yourself.
Yeah.
I couldn't stop listening to the audiobook. It was like watching a movie. It was so amazing what this guy did with his voice. And he added a dimension to it that wasn't there. That vocal, emotional sort of fourth dimension to the book. Really amazing. So there was that too.
And that captured your voice. He captured the voice that you wanted. He captured the voice that you were penning.
So yeah, that was interesting. When you do an audiobook, people audition for it. And we were given, I think, 50 auditions. We had to listen to the same scene, the same 5-minute scene over and over. And I never want to hear that scene again. It's in my head. And some of these people really didn't get it. Gil is 27. He's from Ohio. He grew up in Ohio and LA. And I had a guy read him with a British accent. It was just so strange and bizarre. But the majority of the readers were pretty good. The majority of the readers got what we were going for, but somehow didn't get the female voices. There are so many characters in this book. And I hadn't even realized how many until we went to audiobook. And Jake had asked me to outline each character, and I started doing it. And there are like 50 characters in this book, and he had to do different voices for every one. So it was huge. And he does the women's voices and, these big guys. He does the bass voices. But the thing about Jake was he had Gil's voice down perfect from the beginning, because he is 27 and he just had the perfect voice for Gil. It was exactly what I'd heard in my head. So that was great. And then he was able to do the other voices. And there were a couple where he'd send us a note saying, this is what I'm thinking for this person. And we'd be like, no, let's go this way. And we went back and forth, and then he nailed it. Yeah. So it was a very interesting process, particularly Permy. Permy has one of those, he's kind of a wilderness hippie guy. So he's got this wild onions, man. I can't do it like he does.
Wavy gravy kind of thing.
Exactly. So Jake nailed it. Jake absolutely nailed Permy's voice. And I love it. The audiobook is just, it was so fantastic. So
there's an X factor. There's just an X factor when you're trying to find, it's the same in movies or anything else. Like when you're auditioning an actor, there's just something about them. They're like, that's the one. They resonate. That's exactly. Yeah. Yeah. And they might be totally wrong for something else, but
have you turned any of your books into audiobooks?
No, we've looked into it. It's on the horizon. It's, COVID kind of changed the game there for a while. So, everything is getting back to normal. I'm going to, my content company is going to a convention actually this weekend. And so it's our first time back kind of out in the wild to make a little pun at what you do. But it's going to be nice to finally get back with potential readers and film goers and all of the different projects that the company does. So it's going to be so nice to actually interact with people again, face to face, and get that vibe for what they're looking for, how they respond to what they've read and everything. So hopefully audiobook is on the horizon. I have a couple more projects that we're looking at, but I know it's a process. I have a lot of friends who, I've never done audiobooks, but I have a lot of friends who are audiobook performers. And I know exactly what you went through. And I know the entire process. People think they just sit down and they're like, okay, I'm going to read the book. I'll be done in a couple hours. I'll send the tape off. It's like, no, that's not how it works.
No,
not at all.
People said to me, oh, you should read it. And I love the comments. And if it were a nonfiction book, maybe I would, but not a work of fiction with 50 characters. I can't do all those voices and that drama. I don't have that training. You want a professional to do a novel, and
you're so close to it too. You're so close to the subject matter. Like, it's nice to be able to have somebody's a bit removed, and then you can make the notes.
Yes,
you can. I've edited other people's work, and it's a different experience to work with their words because you don't have an emotional connection to them. You know what I mean? And it's like, I can look at it and be like, okay, well, just from a purely purely mechanical point of view, like this paragraph doesn't work because you have it too early, you have it too late, and there's no emotion attached to it. So to have somebody else come in and read your words, you can kind of kick back and be like, this works, this doesn't work. I can imagine it's very freeing because you're allowing them and their talent to bring life to your words.
Yes. And there's another point here, Eric, and I
Yeah.
think this is something that's valuable to any of your listeners who are aspiring writers. Reading your book aloud. I think my sister had said this to me. As I said, she's a writer. The number one most beneficial thing that anyone told me was to read your book aloud. And I didn't do this, I think, until the third or fourth draft. But when I read it aloud, half that book hit the cutting room floor.
Yes.
I realized just how badly worded some sentences were and how some just don't flow. And some had to be changed to have that poetic, to match the emotion, right? If you're climbing a mountain, you have to have short sentences like, I was doing, and it has to have that climbing a mountain sense. And my older character, Sid, the professor, he speaks he uses very large words, very long sentences. Gil, younger, much shorter. They all need a different rhythm, a different style. And reading it aloud just makes you aware of all that in a way that reading it in your head does not. I thought reading it in your head was fine. No way.
Nope.
No way.
No. And then there's the other thing. Yeah, I'm sure because you are this incredible caliber writer, so this has never happened to you. But there's times where you're reading it aloud, and you find that you have to take a breath because you've been reading the same sentence for so long. And it's like, if I have to breathe in the middle of a sentence, the sentence is too long.
Yes.
It's things like that. So you're like, okay, that didn't work. And there's also as you get through the process, I'm curious, there's a visual aspect to it as well, though. There's a way that the words lie on the page, or lay on the page, depending whatever the proper use is. And sometimes one thing I run into when I edit other people's work is I get really annoyed when people start the same paragraph with the same word. So I'm working on it's like if your character, so like I'm working on one right now where the character's name is Virginia. So if it's like Virginia did this and this and this and does a paragraph, and then the next paragraph, Virginia looked up from da 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 da, and then the next paragraph, Virginia was scared that, and it's like, no, like I realize what you're doing with the paragraph. I realize you have to get the character's name in there. Probably 90% of the people who read the book aren't going to notice it, but I am as the writer. And I'm like, no, there's a better way to do that. There's a better way to start off that graph. And that's when reading it aloud helps, and just looking at it on the page. And there's also a difference. Tell me if I'm wrong. There's also, when you look at a book that you printed out on your printer and you're trying to edit it versus when you get a galley copy, it's a different, it just looks different. It's like it brings it to a new level where you're like, this is the printed word. And there's something really special about that.
I couldn't agree more. Absolutely. And the thing about reading it aloud is so huge. And things like you say, the repeated words or repeated phrases, even something as simple as he said, she said. The first time I went through reading it aloud, I realized every sentence I'm saying, he said, she said, he said, she said, and you don't need it, right? When you're writing, if two people are talking, as long as they're taking turns, you immediately know who said what. And you should know that from the style of the dialogue. It should be obvious, from the words, who's speaking. And if it isn't, you haven't written that dialogue well enough. This was something Jake said when we got to the audiobook. He said, my book really worked well as an audiobook because I'd done that editing. I'd taken that time, I'd read it aloud. And so the dialogue really worked. And it's part of what people call craft. And I certainly cut my teeth on this book because the first draft was miserable in this way. But and the second and the third and the fourth, it wasn't until the fifth or sixth that I think it started really shaping up as something people could appreciate.
It's the building thing is interesting. You made the analogy of a building, and it's kind of funny when I wrote Ascension, the first draft versus what was published is night and day. just night and day. Because initially I was trying to write this thing that was dealing with these very deep issues, but it was still a novel, and it was like I was overwriting. And then I got to it, I'm like, nah, this is an adventure. I need to turn the pages. I need to get people at the end of the chapter. There needs to be a cliffhanger. There needs to be this and that. And it's almost like, your first draft is a split level townhouse in Northern California, and then by the time you get to the final one, it's like a big rambling ranch house somewhere in the Midwest. Like the building changes, the actual structure of your book can change so much that you realize the story you want to tell doesn't work with that format. You almost have to change your entire approach. Other times it's from the moment you sit down, it's your exact way, but it changes a lot.
That's absolutely true. I mean, you're right, Eric. When I started this book, the first 2 chapters were about Gil shopping. They were about him getting ready for this trip, his experience at REI buying equipment, his testing equipment, and his drive up to Fresno, and his relationships. Mm-hmm. And at some point, one of my editors said to me, all right, all that stuff is great. It got you into the character, but now throw it away. You can't start the book with the main character shopping. You have to start with the problem, with what's going on. And so all that got tossed away. And the book starts with Gil driving to Fresno, and everything that was in those first 2 chapters, literally thrown out, thrown in the trash. And a few of the best little parts are in flashback later. Yeah. You probably remember in the first chapter or the second chapter where Sid asks him about his shirt, and Gil flashes back to REI and how he was purchasing the shirt, but the one that was synthetic didn't fit, and how it made his man boobs stick out, and how embarrassing it was. So it's when you get
the flavor, you get that flavor in there, and you get what you need without, and you do a neat thing in the very beginning. Like you get so into his thought process. He's like, he doesn't want to do this. And you're just in there in his mind, and you just drop right in, cut to the chase. It's the old Max Sennett thing. It's like, get right to the action,
And you learn that as a writer. The first 10 pages have to be enthralling, or somebody standing in the bookstore is going to browse it and put it down.
Yeah.
You absolutely, I mean, in the book industry, they say first 10 pages have to be, you have to get the story, the problem, the character, and the reader into it. You have to hook them in those 10 pages or you've lost them.
Yeah,
so absolutely. I had to throw out two entire chapters to get there. But my editors were right. And that's something, again, anyone listening, listen to your editors, right? Don't be that guy who's hanging on to your words and going, I wrote my first copy, I love it. Listen to your editors. You'll learn so much. Your book will be so much better.
They know there's a reason they do what they do. Yes. So what's next? Do you have another book that you're working on? Is that the next project?
I have gotten so into marketing here. I had no idea how much work was in marketing that I'm taking about a year off of writing to just nurture the trail, to do interviews like this, to promote it as much as I can and get it out there. And I'm hoping there'll be a point where it's self-sustaining, where people read it, love it, tell their friends, and it spreads on its own. And at that point, I'll get back into my second book. But I have started writing another book. It's also a hiking book. It's a little more religious than this one. This one does have quite a bit of a spiritual element, but I've got a book about a person. Basically, I'm looking at a priest who's losing faith in his religion, and he goes to hike the Camino, the Camino Santiago over in Spain, in an attempt to take a pilgrimage and really regain his faith. And that's not exactly what's going to happen. It's going to be a surprise, but it's going to be transformational. And that's my next book. And I was going to go over and hike the Camino so I could have the background and the places and the events, and COVID hit. So I haven't been able to go and get the background. I haven't been able to go and do the research. And I've got this story, the outline, the framework. I've got the timbers up on the house. So I know where I want the story to go, but it's just sitting on hold until I finish all the marketing and everything for this. And we get past the pandemic, of course.
Yeah. Do you take notes? Like what's your process for research? Do you journal? Do you take notes? Do you put papers in a box? Like how do you do it?
I will wake up at 3 a.m. sometimes with a brilliant idea, run half naked through the house to my computer desk, scribble on a piece of paper, and later I'll come back and type it up into my outlines. But I have files and files of outlines and notes as they come to me. And you've got to capture them, in my experience, when they come to you. If I'm on a bike ride or on a hiking trip and something hits me, I will sit down and write. And I remember on the PCT, that Oregon trip, I was walking along and I had this inspiration for another scene where he meets these PCT hikers, where I had just met some guys. They really resonated with me. And I thought these 3 characters need to be in the book. So there was this lake. I sat down at the lake for 2 hours and wrote out a scene. And of course, it edited it up later, but I got the main ideas of what I wanted out on paper. So when it hits you, you really have to pause and capture it, because if you try to index it and come back later, you may not have that inspiration.
Yeah.
Writing is very much in the moment.
Yeah. It's not the same if you try to recreate, you're like, oh, there was a way that I did it. And there's a way that I said it and whatever. I also find too that you have to, not all those ideas are great. Some of them you think that, maybe now that we have the visual of you running across the house half naked in the middle of the night. Thank you. I'm sure our listeners love that. But it's
sorry.
No, it's okay. It's okay.
It's real.
It's truth. It's truth. But there's sometimes I think you have ideas and you're rattling them around in your brain. And I call them, sometimes I'll call them orphans, because it's like, I don't quite know where they're going to end up, but I know I need to, they may end up in this project or another project, but there's still something valid to them. So I make sure I write them down and they kind of go in the file. But I'm curious what you think. I find that if I don't get those ideas out of my head, even if I'm not going to do something with them, I can't get more ideas to come in, because that's rattling around in my brain, taking up space. So as soon, because I don't want to forget it, or it's like, oh no, but if I get it written down, I can kind of put it away, let it ruminate. Then I can have something else fill that space. And then that can go down and that can go down. If you dwell on one thing too long, it's stifling you from other things.
Yeah, you're exactly right. I have that exact experience, Eric. I remember biking to work. I like biking to work because you get that space in your head to think. Mm-hmm. And maybe I'd be listening to a book, a podcast or an audio book, when suddenly it'll hit you, right? That idea. And then the idea starts juggling in your head. You have to stop the podcast or the book, and it starts cycling, and you're like, I've got to get this down. So I've learned, you just stop the bicycle, you stop the drive, you stop whatever you're doing, and you write down the idea. And after that, yes, you can go back to whatever you were doing. But if you don't write it down, you're going to forget it. And if you forget you're going to be like, what was that idea? Because it was brilliant. And it may not have been brilliant, but you thought it was at the time, which is another funny thing.
I have this image in my head of you on Olympic Boulevard, like pulled over to the side, like scrolling down with your bike.
It's usually the Strand. I like, LA has that bike path that goes along the beach, and that's where I like biking, away from the cars. I'm always a nature person. So it's always there, and you'll see this guy on the side scribbling something into his notebook. That's me.
Yeah. Well, you're in LA, where how many writers and creatives we have here. So there's got to be a few others kind of scattered around at any given time.
By the time I'm done, there'll be 3 people around me. Hey man, we know what you're doing.
Who's your agent?
Exactly.
So what's the let's wrap it up with this. What's the next hike? Unfortunately, the tsunami warning kind of, you couldn't go on the recent one. Are you going to reschedule that one, or what's next on your agenda for the great outdoors?
Yeah, thanks, Eric. I was going to go out to, as you know, Catalina, and I didn't because there was a tsunami warning, and to go out on a boat and the tsunami is kind of silly.
Yeah.
I don't have another hike planned in the immediate future. I am looking at through hiking the PCT in 2023. So that's my next big hike, is a
Okay.
6-month hike from Mexico to Canada. I'm really looking forward to that. I think this summer, if the pandemic allows, I'm going to get myself over to Europe and either hike the Camino or maybe the GR10, which goes from the Atlantic to the Mediterranean. So that's about a 2-month hike, and I across the Pyrenees, which is gorgeous. So I'm going to do something like that, and of course there'll be weekend trips, but
Yeah.
I don't have a specific plan right now. I've got a couple of other projects going on, and so I'm not. I think it's going to be another month before I'm able to get back out there.
Are you back in the classroom? Are you still virtual teaching over in Santa Monica? Or are you completely back in the classroom in person yet? I don't know what you guys are up to.
We're virtual right now, and in the next semester, there is a mixture of online and live classes. My classes are all online next semester. And then I think we're hoping by the fall, everything will be back in person. If, knock on wood, if there isn't another wave of something or, whatever. So
Yeah.
I think we're coming out of this. I hope this is the end.
It feels like it. It's like every time we feel it. I heard a joke that the next variant is going to play the accordion.
No,
that's how annoying the next one's going to be. So last question. What is your ultimate hike? What is your dream hike that you wish you could do or you want to do, or give me that one. What is the ultimate?
I think for me, that is the PCT in 2023. Yeah. The idea that I'll be 6 months on the trail and be able to go back over, because the John Muir Trail, which is what my book's about, crosses over the Sierra Nevada mountains from Yosemite to Mount Whitney, and the PCT follows, for the most part, the JMT route. So I'll get to revisit that, and then I'll get to go north up to Oregon and then into Washington. And I've never hiked in Washington. So I like Goat Rocks. I hear amazing things about. So I'm really looking forward to that. And also the community. We didn't touch on this, but on trail, there is an incredible sense of community. You meet the same folks over and over. People are very mutually supportive. It's almost like a utopian society out there. People really come back and they say, wow, I wish all of life could be like the relationships we have on trail. And that's another thing I try to capture in my book, is that relational aspect, the sense of that greater community and really getting to know people. So that's why there are so many characters. There's really an extended community on trail, and even a network of what they call trail angels who come out and support you. It's almost like you're doing a religious pilgrimage, and people see you're the monk, and they come and they give you alms, because there are people who they will just come out and give you a ride to town for free, or they come out with apple pies or Snickers bars or whatever, and they just give them to hikers. In Oregon, there was one couple who came out and they cooked this incredible Mexican dinner for all the thru hikers, and it was fantastic. And they don't expect anything but some kindness and thanks in return. And that's very typical of these long hikes. You get this what they call trail magic experience, and it really is magical.
Well, that brings up a question then. So when you hiked Muir, or when you do one of these really, really extensive hikes, and you interact with these people and you have these experiences, what happens when you come back to the real world? And I use quotes with just for that, because I think you might argue that the real world is the trail and we all live where we live. But is it difficult to kind of come back and the hustle or the people, or you're on this high, you've just done, it's almost like an astronaut. Like you've done this amazing thing. You've seen the world differently. And now you're coming and you accomplished this incredible thing. I mean, I don't know if I could do it, but then you come back to the world. You come back to the world and it's kind of like, all right, now I'm back at school, or I'm back in traffic, or I'm back in, dealing with all this stuff. Is it a letdown? How does that affect you emotionally?
It's a great question, Eric, and it's complicated. There is a thing, and it's real, called post-trail depression, and people go through it. I've met a number of people, and I know some people who, after getting off these long hikes, have gone through depression where
really
they just miss it. Yeah, it does happen. For me, the cure for that was writing this book. I was able to transition from thinking about the JMT almost every day to, okay, writing the book was getting myself back in that frame of mind and being out there. And I read a lot of hiking books. So there is that sense of, it's not just the community. The community is part of it. There's a sense of walking in nature, being in a place like Yosemite or like what's behind me here in Evolution Valley. In the book, I compare it to walking in God's workshop. You really feel you're connected to everything. You really feel a deeper spiritual sense. And when you walk back out of the real world, as you said, and you're coming back to our man-made construct, that's missing. And it's like you've been cut off from that. And in my book, I'm not going to give any spoilers, but definitely at the end, there's a moment where Gil is feeling that when he comes off trail. And you can see that near the end of the book where Gil feels disconnected from all that suddenly. So it is very real. It is very much a challenge coming off trail. And I think this is why I'm getting a lot of sunlight. I'm going down over those mountains. Sorry about that.
Nature's calling you. Nature's calling you. Come back to us.
If I step here, there we go. Sorry about that.
You're all good.
Being on video. So yeah, there's this spiritual sense of being out there, connected to everybody. Everybody's open and friendly, and you feel like you're in some higher place, connected to nature. And then you come back to this grind of the cell phone and the workplace and the busyness and the closed. People are a lot more guarded in the city. So it is a big transition. It is difficult. And I think a lot of people go and do a second hike or a third one. There's the Triple Crown of long hikes where people will do the PCT and the Appalachian Trail and the Colorado, the CDT. And I can really understand how people start doing that because it's a different world out there. But I wouldn't tell anyone to start out by doing that. I would start on something a little shorter, go and try a weekend backpack, and you'll see, you'll start to get into this, and you'll start to touch these experiences. Or in my book, you can do it vicariously. You can see how this changes you, because it certainly, I mean, that's the motivation for why I wrote this book, was to share that experience in a first person way through the main character. And I think from the feedback I'm getting that I was able to achieve most of that. It may not be the same as actually being there first person, but I think I did it. I think I get that across, and I hope so anyway.
Yeah. Well, the book's The Trail, and the link is in the show notes. Do you do social media, or do you do any of that stuff to promote? Are there places people can go check you out?
I'm on Facebook. I've got a website, ethangallogly.com. So spelling is a challenge, but if you look at the links, I'm sure you're going to post, you'll see it there.
It'll be in the show notes. Absolutely. Yep. Absolutely. So everybody check out Ethan. Ethan, thank you so much for spending the time with me. And I'm really sorry you didn't get to go because of the tsunami and everything. I was looking forward to hearing about the hike, but you'll have to tell me about the next one. So everybody check out The Trail. thanks for spending some time with me. I really, really appreciate it. I learned a lot, and it was fun to chat with you about the outdoors. So I need to go on a hike. That's what I've learned.
Eric.
All right.
It's been a pleasure, and get back to me. Let me know how that first long distance hike goes for you. I think you're going to find it transformational, and that may be the subject of 8 or 10 podcasts before before you can come back to other things.
Maybe every show's a little bit different.
Support comes from the History's Trainwrecks podcast that focuses on stories like a temper tantrum that changed history, the president who promised not to run again and regretted it for the rest of his life, the World War II general who lost his pants on a secret mission in enemy territory. The History's Trainwrecks podcast, available now.
Hey everybody, hope you enjoyed the show. Help us spread the word by subscribing and leaving a review. If you want to support us even more, you can find a link to our Patreon account in the show notes. And if you're one of our diehard fans, head on over to the VikingDogStore.com, where you can find official Open Highway merchandise to show your support to the entire world. But most of all, thanks for listening.
For the highways of America, which for so many years were an assortment of as many designs and pavements as there were states, are now becoming one big road that can take you anywhere faster, safer, and more directly than ever before. What is this big road? Where is it going? How much has been built? How much is yet to come? These are questions we ask. Certainly traveling the entire system would be a memorable experience, but few of us have the time for such a trip.
Copyright, Viking Dog 2022. All rights reserved. The Open Highway is a trademark of Viking Dog LLC.